Okay, everybody. So today we're going to be journeying right into Romans chapter 10. Recap from our last Bible study, or actually our last 9 studies. Romans chapters 1 through 3. Remember, God's been painting this really amazing picture of a big problem. But then in chapter 4, he begins to reveal this huge solution. That problem is that all of humanity is essentially spiritually dead. We're all spiritually dead, and we've all been separated from God. We've discovered that the answer to the problem itself, the real core problem, spiritual deadness, the answer is not stop lying, stop cheating, stop lusting, but rather what we need is to get life, right? And we don't get that life by doing good works. Nobody gets that work by less sinning, but rather solely by our faith. And by our faith, we literally get to participate in the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? And this is what true Christianity is. It's waking up, having died to your old spiritually dead self, and then being born again and becoming the new self. You have a new identity, and now the Spirit is suddenly your guide, and that's why we don't need this set of laws or rules to guide us, right? We don't need someone telling us you don't do this and that. We don't need an instruction book, if you will. We've got that living inside of us. And in chapter 9, we started asking, okay, well, who exactly is this offer for? Is it for all of us? Or is this just a few chosen ones? Remember, we talked about that whole predestination. And before we get started, let's recap Paul's summary, okay? Paul's total point in chapter 9, which has been wildly misunderstood. So we just want to rewind and hit again what we talked about in chapter 9, verses 30 and 31. Was this about predestination? Meaning I choose you, but you're not chosen. You get heaven, you get hell. Is that what Paul was really saying, or was Paul teaching us something different? So this is what Paul said in the last chapter. After going 29 verses of all this stuff that people have chalked up to be as God saying you're predestined, they've missed the point. What Paul is saying is this: what shall we say then? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness, never tried, never had any effort, never ran after Moses, never even heard of the law, right? Who did not pursue righteousness, that they have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith, a righteousness, I'm sorry, that is by faith, but the people of Israel who pursued, they chased it, they worked hard, they did everything they could, who pursued the law as the way of righteousness, right? What were they pursuing the rules for? As their way of righteousness. They did not obtain their goal. Why not? In verse 32, and this is Paul's, really his conclusion, because they did not obtain righteousness for this reason, not because they weren't chosen. This is what Paul's saying why they didn't obtain, because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. So, is this about predestination and being hoping that you're one of the chosen ones? Let's get a preview of Paul's thoughts here in verse 12 and 13 for the chapter that we're going to be studying today. Okay? We're going to see this here in about 12 verses. Paul's going to tell us, for there is no difference between the Jew and the Gentile. The Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So it doesn't seem to me that chapter 9 was at all about God picking some and not others. Everyone, it said here, everyone, that's why I highlighted it, who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. I know some are going to say that we can only call if God draws us, right? That's a very common response. But John 12:32 tells us when the Son of Man is lifted up, he will draw all men unto himself. All men. God wishes that none would perish, right? The Bible tells us this. So either God can't seem to keep his will, or we have a little bit of free will in choosing him. He draws us, but he never forces us. I want you to notice the highlighted word all too. The Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. Good stuff. I just want to make sure that let's just dive in, as a matter of fact. Romans chapter 10, we're going to start with verse 1 and 2. Paul says, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Now let's be honest here. The Jewish people here, they're trying hard, folks. None of us could compete with these guys when it came down to effort, now could we? These guys are zealous like nobody's business. Paul seems sad here. He wants to see the Israelites saved, but many of them just don't get this whole Jesus thing. They don't believe in him. And the Jews are running hard and they're trying and they're cranking out effort. But the message of the gospel is effort does not count towards righteousness. Now, I understand some people will think that it does after we're saved. But the truth is, folks, it didn't before we got saved, and it doesn't now. I can, in some ways, see how the Jews might struggle with this, right? I get it for them. But it always surprises me when Christians today don't see this very thing that's like right in front of us. So verse 3 then says, since they did not know the righteousness of God, and what they do, they sought to establish their own. They did not submit to God's righteousness. So they tried to do it their own way through 613 laws. They did a good job, maybe some of them, right? Maybe some of them, I don't know, maybe they did hit 90%. I doubt it. Let's just say they did. Some of them got 90% of the law, but remember, when it comes to righteousness, it's you get 100% or 0%. If you stumble at one point of the law, you are guilty of it all. There is no, you did a pretty good job when it comes to law keeping. Verse 4, Christ is the culmination, which means the end. Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for who? For everyone who believes. Now notice, he doesn't say everyone who is chosen. It's for everyone who believes. Moses writes about this. Writes this about the righteousness that is by law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Why does that bring Christ down, you might ask? Because if you're saying, look at Billy's great life. Look how awesome he is. We're looking at his works and his law keeping and his lack of sin. If that's what you're looking at for that guy's salvation, you're bringing what Christ did on the cross down, and you're looking at the man instead of looking at the Savior. You're literally looking at his behavior as what saves him. Romans 10:7 again says, or don't say, or who will descend into the deep, who will go to hell. That is to bring Christ up from the dead. So again, looking at someone's struggles with sin and saying, oh, he's definitely going to hell. You can tell, but look at him, boy, he's just a wreck. We've probably all been guilty of this, self-included at times. It's not okay. But again, whosoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, not whoever doesn't struggle with sin, and sometimes a lot. What's the real message that's going on here? And I think Paul's getting ready to tell us here in the next couple of verses. Verses 8 and 9, he says, but what does it say? It says that the word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. Now notice these yous in yours. That is the message concerning faith. that we proclaim, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, now I know a couple places in the Bible we see this thing chosen and predestination. It's funny how we just grab on. We see it a few times and we just build a whole theology, a whole new, denomination out of it, if you will. But you see, most of the Bible we see you choose, whosoever calls. God wishes that none would perish, right? And do you see all these yours and yous here? Not if God chooses you, but if you believe. You have a decision to make for Jesus, right? So verses 10 to 13, for it is with your heart again, that you believe and are justified. And it is with your mouth that you confess your faith and are saved. As the scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame, for there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses who? All who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Again, Paul's not saying everyone who God calls on, right? He said everyone who calls on God. There is a huge difference in just flipping those two words around. So that is not God choosing, it's you doing the choosing. So then we get to verse 14. He says, how then can they who call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they've not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? So if God was basically making everyone just believe, then we wouldn't need preachers now, would we? So we would not even need the Bible for that matter. I mean, let's be honest with you. If God's just doing it all and we don't get a choice, what is the point of sharing the gospel? What's the point of ministry? What's the point of telling anybody about Jesus? There is no point if God is doing all the choosing and he's not allowing us to make a personal decision for his son. Verse 15, 16, he says, and how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. In other words, they had a choice. They did not accept it. Continues in verse 16. He says, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? So apparently, some of these people have received the message and some have rejected it. That's why when we read verses like Hebrews chapter 3, verse 15, when it tells us today, if you hear his voice, notice what he says, do not harden your heart as you did in rebellion. Why in the world are we going to say, do not harden your heart if you're not doing the hardening? Apparently, it's us. Don't harden your heart. Not, hey, you don't really get a choice. God's going to do the harden. Listen, God is not hardening the hearts of us today, right? Especially not you Gentiles. It's another discussion with some of the Jews, but a personal hardening. But here he's telling them not to harden their hearts. And he says that because you can choose as an act of your own free will to harden your heart. And when you hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, say, no, thank you, I ain't interested. And that is a personal, willful decision that each individual will make as we are all drawn towards Christ when he was lifted up from the cross. So verse 17, 18 says, consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Of course they did. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. So if you ask me, this speaks directly to the worries about what people who never heard about God, right? What about it? What about, if somebody's in this country and no one's ever mentioned, Jesus to them, right? We've got this verse. We've got God's creation, right? We've got God drawing us. it's about faith, right? It's not about knowing everything. God talks about, by my creation, you will know that I am. And on the day of judgment, you will every human being will be without excuse. I've made myself known to all people. How? Look around you. Look at the universe, the birds, the flowers, the trees, the mountains. You can look at creation and instinctively God is saying, you know. And that doesn't mean you won't deny him, but God is saying, like, look, most of us, were Christians. At one point, you looked around and you said, there's got to be a God. I can't look at this and deny, at least, I mean, literally flat out deny God. I think you have to commit a serious amount of intellectual suicide if you're going to look at all of creation and even deny the possibility of a God. Verse 19. Again, I ask, did Israel not understand? And of course they did. It was in their scriptures. What did God say to Abraham? He says, I will make you the father of, and I quote, many nations. Israel was how many nations? Well, I'm going to submit to you that it was one nation, right? Okay, so now for the final one, we get into Romans chapter 10, verses 19 to 21. Sorry, it says, First Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. Predestination? Verse 21 says, God held out his hands to the Jews all day long. What was the problem? He says, but they were disobedient and obstinate. That doesn't sound like God was doing a whole lot of forcing there to me. Obstinate means stubbornly refusing to change one's opinion or chosen course of action. All right, guys, that wraps up Romans chapter 10. Joining us next week when we dive into Romans chapter 11. Hope you enjoyed.